Finally, some good news. The Boston Red Sox and Rafael Devers did agree to an 11-year deal on Wednesday night. Finally, something that we weren't sure was going to happen finally happened. I am your host of Locked On Red Sox, NESN's Lauren Willand, and today we have a very exciting episode. We have ESPN's Joon Lee joining us. He wrote about the Red Sox and Rafael Devers being galaxies apart just a few weeks ago, about his contract extension. We talk about that. We talk about how this contract came to be. We look at some players who Red Sox fans should look out for in 2023. We talk about the 2023 season as a whole, that there still needs work to be done, and where Joon Lee will put this Red Sox team at the end of a 162 game season. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Red Sox, your daily Boston Red Sox podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are here with staff writer from ESPN, Joon Lee. So how are we doing today, Joon?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, man. And what a great time for you to come on. As I mentioned to you before we hit record, was definitely expecting a much different tone for this episode. Did not expect the Red Sox to ultimately extend Rafael Devers to an 11-year, $331 million deal. And it's interesting, being able to speak with you, because 17 days ago you reported that the Red Sox and Devers were galaxies apart. And I'm curious, from what you heard from the rumblings since you wrote about that, what sort of changed since then?
Well, I talked to Chaim Bloom, I think, in that report, and he said that they were going to go beyond reason, and he lived up to his word. I mean, they got very aggressive in the weeks after Bogaerts signed with the Padres, where they basically raised the offer more than $100 million to get to where Devers and his camp kind of wanted them to be. And I don't think that Devers and his camp expected that kind of massive jump to happen immediately, which is why they were able to kind of come to agreement, because they basically offered him pretty close to probably what Devers would have gotten on the open market if he had been a free agent this offseason. And so that's ultimately kind of the biggest thing that changed.
And it happened so fast too. They avoided arbitration with the 1-year deal. And then all of a sudden it was stuff started picking up. There were rumblings everywhere. And then all of a sudden this deal was done and agreed upon. Do you think that they're looking at, what happened with Bogaerts, and when they said that Devers is our number one priority now, that this whole time maybe they did mean that, and they've seen what's happened with other homegrown talent, and they're like, we need to lock him up before he potentially does hit free agency and his value just goes through the roof even more.
Sure. Yeah. So I reported, I think this was back in April, that the Red Sox had always prioritized Devers over Bogaerts, just because he was the kind of player from a skill standpoint and also from an age standpoint that they believed that warranted a deal that would kind of be in the territory that he ended up being in, 11 years, $300+ million. And so I think that being in that was kind of the major thing first. And I think that there was, the Red Sox said a lot about Bogaerts being kind of the top priority. But when I had an opportunity to talk to Scott Boras about how the Bogaerts kind of pursuit played out, he said that they were way more aggressive on Yoshida than they ever were on Bogaerts, because he represents both of them. And so I think that kind of, the actions always speak louder than the words. And I think that they obviously wanted to get Devers done, and that's what I'd been hearing internally in terms of what they wanted to do. But in regards to whether or not, I think that there was a direct effect in how the entire Xander Bogaerts situation played out, affecting the way that they approached Devers. Because when you have a fan base revolting the way that, us as Red Sox fans were at the time, I think that there was a sentiment that, we do need to make a move that they believe is going to help the team long-term in terms of building out the roster foundation, while also being one that also helps the fans in some form.
I think as well, what we saw with the whole Xander situation really sort of being a distraction all throughout last season. I'm curious, do you think that's one of the main reasons why they wanted to get this done prior to spring
100%.
training?
100%. I think that having the main storyline for the Red Sox heading into spring training being, are they going to trade Devers? Is that a thing that's going to happen? Being a thing that looms over everything, I think that is a major concern for the team heading into spring training. I think it is definitely part of the motivating reason why they were in a position where they felt like they need to get this aggressive in getting this deal done.
And we saw that, last season that it was a storyline with Bogaerts no matter what. Anytime he would do something big, if there was something going wrong with the team, it was always like the contract, or do you still want to be here? Is your mindset still the same? And I don't know if fans would want to go through that again. I don't know if the Red Sox would want to go through that again with Devers. But now that Devers is signed to this deal, do you think this maybe changes the narrative of the Red Sox offseason, or do you still think that there's work to be done here?
Well, I think that it changes the vibe considerably because this is the foundation of the roster for at least the next 11 years. I mean, having Rafael Devers in there guarantees that you're going to have at least one franchise cornerstone type of dude in that lineup. Maybe third base, maybe first base, maybe designated hitter, but having that kind of dynamic hitter is something that most teams yearn for, and the Red Sox have a guy like that locked up. And so it is a step towards building the larger plan of what the team hopes, Chaim Bloom and company hope that this roster will eventually turn into. And I think that having just one step towards that is an enormous thing, and just like calming everyone down. Because if the team had gone into spring training with the idea that, oh man, like we don't have Devers signed, maybe we have to trade in spring training, it totally changes the entire vibe around the team, becomes a distraction, affects guys in the clubhouse. And so I think that having that settled for now and having a dramatic difference in what it was just 4 weeks ago is an enormous thing for the Red Sox as an organization.
And one of the main things that, Lauren and I have talked about a lot throughout this offseason is the trying to understand the direction or the identity of this team. And I feel like now that, Devers is locked up for 11 years, you get a little bit more sense of and a little bit more clarity on what sort of identity this team has in direction. There's still some more questions and everything like that. But one thing that I'm curious from what you heard throughout the contract negotiations, we heard last year that Matt Olson's deal, I think 8 years, 160 million, around that range was sort of, the benchmark for what the Red Sox were offering Devers last year. And I'm curious if, what we saw, not only Bogaerts get, but also Trey Turner get, 11, 12 years, if that's sort of motivated the Red Sox to want to go towards, rather than 8, the 10, 11, what they ultimately ended up signing Devers for.
I think that played a role in it. I think that Devers getting better defensively at third base played a role in it. And then I think it's also generally the concerns around, how Devers is going to age as a player. That's something that people are at least thinking about. And so having that in there on top of just having another year of consistent production at the plate, even if he did fall off in the second half a little bit, having those numbers put up, I think that all of that kind of plays a role. Because I don't, from my vantage point, I still watch a lot of baseball. Like Olson and Devers were, I thought, in different classes even last offseason. And so I think that this kind of aligns more with what the industry views Devers as, rather than kind of the evaluation that we had last year where the team was thinking about him in the range of Matt Olson.
Makes sense.
And this offseason has been filled with a lot of up and down for Red Sox fans. With they get a closer in Kenley Jansen, and then you bring in Yoshida, who should have a good bat. But overall, what has been your assessment of this offseason that the Red Sox have put together thus far?
Oh man, that's a tough question. I mean, so much of it depends on Yoshida. I mean, you spend that much money on a guy from Japan who hasn't played in Major League Baseball. That's going to be a huge determining factor. I mean, there were reports coming out, and my colleague Hollywood Daniel wrote a story talking to some executives about how some executives thought that Yoshida was an overpay, but then there were also executives who were willing to kind of go on the record, also talking about how they kind of viewed Yoshida, maybe not necessarily as much as in the financial range that the Red Sox did, but in the same kind of ballpark ish. And so I think a lot of how we view this offseason is going to hinge on his performance. I still think that they're a fourth place team in this division right now. I think the Jays, the Rays, and the Yankees are just more talented. But we've seen in the past that talent isn't necessarily like the determining factor in whether or not a team makes the playoffs. I think they're going to be in the playoff mix. But there's other teams around baseball, especially in the American League, who are also going to be in the mix that aren't in the American League East. And so I think there is a step in the right direction, especially getting Devers signed. That's probably the biggest move of the offseason, the biggest move that this team will be able to make. And they have a lot of money freed up heading into next offseason when Ohtani is going to be a free agent, Manny Machado is going to be a free agent. There's Julio Urias is going to be a free agent, Max Scherzer is going to be a free agent. And then the offseason after that, Shane Bieber is a free agent, Juan Soto is a free agent. So they have a lot of flexibility. How they use that is going to be the ultimate question. And not getting back Xander and getting anything back for Xander and him leaving for San Diego, that's a huge blow. And obviously Jeter Downs getting DFA'd is a huge thing. So I'm kind of split. Like, there are obviously things that they did well. Devers getting signed is a huge thing, but we felt the ramifications of a lot of the moves that Bloom and the front office has made in the past and in negative ways this offseason. So it really hinges on a lot of these guys like Yoshida kind of panning out, and a guy like Jansen, Chris Martin actually being into the bullpen, because you never know year to year with those guys.
We hope you're enjoying our episode with ESPN's Joon Lee. We will get you right back to our conversation as soon as I tell you about BetOnline, because betonline.net remains your number one source for your sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get the latest odds and trends for every professional and even amateur league out there, from pro football to college bowl season to basketball to the NHL. Everything is covered at betonline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, which you probably do if you are listening to Locked On Red Sox, you can even find those at BetOnline as well. We're always the fastest and the easiest way to get your betting info. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. You can get the odds and the trends for tonight's Bruins game on the West Coast. Everything you could possibly need is at BetOnline, where the game starts.
And you brought up the money that's going to be freed up, and you actually tweeted yesterday that the Red Sox could have between $47 and $70.65 million, depending on sort of the club options heading into next offseason. And one other thing that you mentioned in your recent article about Devers is that that there's multiple sources that the front office might be interested in locking up some other top young contributors. And somebody from over on Twitter asked, could we count on a Casas or Bayo extension sometime in the near future? And what would the timeline be for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the type of thing that Chaim Bloom is interested in doing, because he wants to sign players pre-arbitration and get them potentially before they turn into superstars. And so I think the team's internal valuation on whether they like a guy is going to factor into that, because when you kind of lay out the way that the front office approaches contracts, there's they look at a guy like Xander Bogaerts getting an 11-year deal, and they feel as if the team is taking on way too much risk by committing to that length of time and that length of money, or that amount of money for that long. And so they feel like those moves put the team in too much danger in terms of putting them in a sticky spot. Whereas they view pre-arb extensions like the one they gave Garrett Whitlock, a kind of 50-50 risk, where the team takes on some risk in terms of committing money to a guy who maybe hasn't necessarily performed to that level yet over the course of long term, while the player also receives some level of security in terms of, injuries happening, their performance falling off. They get some level of guaranteed money that is going to be generational wealth for their family, on top of just having the sense from the team that they believe in them, that they believe he can turn into a star. And so I think all of that kind of factors into the way that the team is approaching this. And so how the team approaches Bayo, Casas, I think is going to fall into that realm, especially if they start to show flashes of being legit major leaguers next year, because that's how you get really good value as a team. And for a player is a way to, get generational wealth, even if that doesn't necessarily mean maximizing the amount of money you might make in the next, near-term future.
Yeah, I was going to ask if Casas and or Bayo have, monster seasons, or they start to show the flashes of the potential that we know that everyone is hyped about. do you think that's when the Red Sox will jump at the opportunity to try to either sign them long-term or maybe even just kind of talk to them and be like, listen, we like what we see and this is our plan, but we like getting them locked up, like you said, before they become that superstar probably will be crucial to this team long-term and also locking up homegrown talent. But if they start showing those flashes that we saw Bayo and Worcester do, and we've seen it with Casas and Worcester as well, does that kind of speed the process up?
Yes, 100%. I think that if they have strong first halves, I think that is something that the front office will consider. From just the mindset that I've heard from folks who work there, that is kind of the mindset that they take, where it's like being able to lock up these guys early and have them potentially turn into superstars and have them on very cheap contracts as a result of that, I think is something that they will strongly consider.
We also heard Tristan Casas a little bit in some trade talks involved with the Miami Marlins. We've also heard Red Sox have interest in Miguel Rojas, Pablo Lopez, and I'm curious from what you've heard, how seriously fans should really take those talks with the Marlins.
I think that there's always conversations that happen. I don't have any personal sourcing on how serious those conversations are, but there are conversations that happen all the time. Sometimes, teams leak stuff to reporters to kind of gauge public reaction, gauge public interest, and also just like to let other teams know that, hey, these guys might be available. And so I can't personally speak to how likely or anything or how serious those talks are. But I do know that, they're going to, Heim has said at multiple points this offseason, like they're going to be aggressive and at least asking on the trade market, which makes sense, just given the fact that the free agent market is kind of empty right now.
I'm of the belief that, that you should always listen to a trade call and just see what someone has to offer. But would you consider Casas or Bayo? Would you consider either of those untouchable for the Red Sox to trade?
I don't think anyone is untouchable. I think Bloom has said that himself. Like the right deal with Marcelo Meyer, I think that like is in play too. I'm not saying that that's going to happen, and I think it's very, 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 very unlikely. But I think that if you're a general manager, there's no reason to ever say that anyone is off limits.
And one thing, looking at all the question marks still with this team heading into spring training is still a little bit of the uncertainty that the starting rotation, especially at the top, is going to be sustainable. And not really having somebody who's considered an ace. I don't really think with Chris Sale coming back, only pitching 12 starts in 3 years, you can really consider him an ace or top of the line starter. But I'm curious if you could see the Red Sox looking to aggressively try and get a frontline starter through the trade market, whether it's Shane Bieber, Corbin Burns, or like a Pablo Lopez from the Marlins.
I think there are conversations you have to explore if you're the Red Sox, because who knows with Chris Sale? You don't know if he's going to be able to hold up long term, if he's going to even have a healthy season this year. Mm-hmm. And so I think that just exploring top end pitching, like that's the hardest thing to get. I think that's why Dave Dombrowski was so aggressive in getting Chris Sale, trading, Kopech and Yoel Moncada way back when. And so I think that being in that spot and with the ambitions that this front office definitely does have in winning a World Series within their budget constraints that have been put down by ownership, I think that is something that they're at least ask around about.
Do you think a deal for a top end starter can get done without a Marcelo Meyer, Tristan Casas? I don't think Duran or Dahlbuck is enough to even try to start that conversation. But do you get a deal done without those three names?
Well, I think Meyer is in a different class. I think everyone around baseball views Meyer in a different class than Casas. And, Dahlbeck was a guy that was like pretty highly regarded when he came up as a first base prospect. Like we see flashes all the time in the big leagues. Like I think back to Will Middlebrooks when he came up, who's obviously a great broadcaster now, but he had a flash that like 80 game stretch that he played with the Red Sox his rookie year. And then he wasn't able to put it together. Dahlbeck, has had a flash and was able to put it together last year. And so I think Casas is still like a little bit of a TBD. I think that there's a little bit of a sense of like, oh, Meyer is he's this like star talent that I think puts him in a different class. And I think it's going to be very hard to convince any team to not have him in a deal if you're trading for a guy in the caliber of Lopez or Bieber.
Right. And, one of the position that is really up in the air, sort of what it'll look like on opening day, is second base or shortstop. Are you going to move Story over to shortstop, Kike to second base, then who will play center field? Maybe Christian Arroyo. Maybe they go out and trade for somebody. But I'm curious on your thoughts on the middle infield.
So from what I've heard, they feel confident about Story being able to play shortstop. There's been a lot of talk about whether or not his arm strength is capable of playing at the position. From the conversations I've had with people over there, they kind of look at it as like second base. You don't need to make as many hard throws as you do at shortstop. And there were concerns about Story's kind of velocity before he came over to the Red Sox. And so they signed him knowing that. And so I think that there is a level of confidence that they feel good that Story can play there. I mean, he's also just like a great, like he was a great defensive second baseman when he was healthy last year at many points. And so I think that that's something that they're all taking into consideration. But I think that they're in a position where if the right shortstop deal pops up, if the right second base deal pops up, it kind of gives them a little bit of flexibility to be able to do both. But my guess, barring any sort of like crazy move for like a star shortstop on the trade market, that Trevor Story is probably going to be the starting shortstop next year.
And that makes the most sense. That's what a lot of people had said when he originally signed here last year. There was always that kind of narrative. And of course, he's played shortstop with the Colorado Rockies. But you look at the outfield and you look at even, kind of Bobby Delbeck and Jarren Duran, and in particular, those two, where do they fit on this team? Is this a big spring training for them coming up to kind of decide what their role is with the organization?
I would say so. I mean, it's hard not to think that if you're just like anyone who watches baseball, like Jarren Duran obviously just had like a rough time with the fans last year and just dealing with the media market. I think how he deals with that is going to play a huge role. And Dahlbeck, it's kind of make or break at this point. Like he might be like a change of scenery candidate. Like it might just not be a position for that to work out long term. And so I think all of that plays a role into this.
And two other guys that we've heard a lot, potentially, could be on the team next year or could be on their way out is Alex Verdugo and Tanner Houck. And I'm curious from your vantage point, could you see both of those guys on the depth chart on opening day, or could you most likely see them being traded before the?
I think I think those guys make sense to be at least in discussions. I'm curious to see how the rotation plays out because there's 6 guys that can be in the rotation right now, especially given that they just added Kluber between Bayo, Whitlock, Houck, Sale. I mean, all of that stuff is going to be, and Pivetta, obviously. All of that's going to be really interesting to see play out. The Red Sox have been really high on Tanner Houck as a starter in the past. I think that the evaluation almost goes back and forth sometimes where it's like, maybe he's a back end reliever. Like he's got 2 pitches, but sometimes the 2 pitches like plays up really well, as a starter. And so I think that there's been a lot of back and forth in terms of how they view Tanner Houck. And so I think that how this spring training kind of plays out, how he looks in the early part of the season is going to play a big role in the shape of all of that. And then Verdugo, I mean, they still believe that he can be a all-star type player. We've seen flashes of that. I mean, 2020, he looked really great. He hasn't kind of looked like the same player since. And he was really, really highly regarded coming up through the minor leagues with the Dodgers as well. And so I think that all of that, it's going to take the right deal because those 2 guys are kind of in positions where the evaluation goes back and forth. And I think that how they kind of show up in spring training, how they look, I think that is going to play a huge role in determining how this team evaluates and whether or not they feel like they can move forward with them.
The starting rotation is a big question mark, especially with Garrett Whitlock being moved to the rotation and possibly Tanner Houck. Do you think either of those guys have a shorter leash, or will the Red Sox, specifically more with Whitlock, kind of stick to the plan and let's get him a full year as a starter before making any sort of decision?
I think with Whitlock, they're really high on his potential as a starter. And I think that it's much more likely, just given the fact that they added Jansen and Martin this offseason, that they stick with him in the rotation. I think there was points last year where he looked really, really good. Like his stuff really does play up as a starter. And the evaluation that they have internally is that he can be like a really good 3, potentially a number 2 starter. And I think that he has the stuff to do that. So I think that is how they're going to play. And I think that Whitlock and Houck are almost like, if Whitlock kind of stays in the rotation, I think everyone expects Bayo to be in the rotation just because of how good his stuff is. I think that's going to play a role in shaping kind of Tanner Houck's, role on this team. And also like, I'm curious to see like Corey Kluber wasn't that great last year. He was healthy. He had like a 4.1 ERA last year. Like how he looks in spring training. If he looks like he's done, like that would obviously slot Tanner Houck into the rotation. So I think there's a lot of question marks with this rotation. But ultimately, like this is all kind of like moving around, chess pieces, like moving around furniture in the same room without upgrading anything. Like, they're going to need a lot from this rotation, a lot of surprises from the rotation to be able to make a strong playoff run next year. They're going to need Garrett Whitlock to like kind of be the number 2 starter. Like Nick Pivetta is Nick Pivetta. Like I'm not expecting that guy to suddenly turn into like a top of the rotation starter. They're going to need Brian Bayo to be really good. They're going to need a guy like Corey Kluber to be good. They're going to need Chris Sale to stay healthy. Like this is the entire pivot point of the entire team and their trajectory for success next year.
And then one guy a lot of people forget is James Paxton too. And, that's one thing with all those question marks and all those guys that you could potentially have slot in that rotation. One thing that I brought up a few weeks ago was potentially a 6-man rotation after you see how everybody sort of plays out over the first month or so. And we saw the Astros do that a little bit last year with Christian Javier, making his rookie debut in the rotation, Justin Verlander coming back from TJ. But curious your thoughts on the possibility of them using a 6-man rotation.
They've shied away from it a lot. Like I think Bloom and both Cora don't fully buy into that. And so I think that I guess there's a chance, especially if everyone looks good, but then you're like kind of minimizing the number of starts that you have for some of the best stars in the rotation. And so I kind of lean towards that not being a real possibility.
Makes sense.
With all the, still the question marks, with all the uncertainty still, who are certain players, whether it's in the lineup or in the rotation, that fans should really keep their eye on in 2023?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like it's kind of the obvious answers. Like, what are they going to do with Verdugo? Does Verdugo show something, or are they going to have to go after someone bigger in the offseason? Like, it is the Alex Verdugo kind of experiment and hope that he turns into an all-star over. I think that this is kind of the pivot year for that. And I think it's going to be it's going to play a huge role in just the trajectory of this team. Because if he turns into an all-star, this lineup looks very, very different. But that's a huge question. I think that he's one of the major pivot points of the team. What Kike looks like is a huge pivot point for the team. Is that season that he had as a full-time starter what he's going to really be like when he's totally healthy on a year-to-year basis? Because we've seen flashes in the pan for 1 year before. And so that's one of the big questions for me. And then Chris Sale is kind of the obvious one, but like if he stays healthy, it's going to be huge. If he's good, it's going to be huge. He hasn't been really good like 3 years. So we have these memories of who Chris Sale was, especially in that World Series run, but he hasn't been that guy in a long time, and he hasn't stayed healthy. So I think that those are the 3 people that I look towards right now.
Even when he did come back in like 2021, I've had PTSD on this podcast talking about it before, but I remember when he played the Orioles and I think he let up like 7-8 runs and like, who is this guy?
Right.
But, not only with the question marks, as we mentioned with the rotation, but the lack of power in the lineup, I'm curious from your thoughts, if opening day was tomorrow and you had to predict how many wins the Red Sox would have in 2023, what would be your number?
Oh, man. 83.
I like that.
83. Yeah.
I think fans would be okay with hearing that after last year.
Yeah.
Why's that?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, why is that? I think that some of the things that need to go right will go right, and then we'll see things that that we didn't expect to go wrong. And I just don't think that the talent level is good enough in this division to be able to keep up. I do think it's going to be interesting to see the effect of the new schedule where, there's not a heavy emphasis on just the division in the same way as there was in the past in terms of the games played. And so that'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. But I just don't think that the talent level is up to par to be able to make a serious run like at a World Series title. So, and I just think that there's too many good teams around the American League.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, especially with how stacked the AL East is, it's going to be tough to be able to compete in that division. But really appreciate all your insight and all your time, Joon, today. If anybody wants to, follow you on Twitter, support your great articles that you put out each and every single week, how can they do that?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Joon Lee. I'm on Instagram at Joon and on TikTok at I am Joon Lee. So follow me over there.
I love it. Really appreciate it, man.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for making Locked On Red Sox your first listen of every day. And thank you so much to ESPN's Joon Lee for joining us. We greatly appreciate him taking time out of his day to talk Devers, the 2023 Red Sox, and everything in between. Please rate, review, and subscribe to Locked On Red Sox right here on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify. Wherever you get your podcast is where you can find us. Be sure to check out all the other Locked On shows across the network: Locked On Yankees, Locked On Astros, Locked On Phillies. Everyone does such a great job bringing you baseball content even throughout the offseason. And now that you've made Locked On Red Sox your first listen, head on over to Locked On MLB Prospects to make it listen number 2. Host Lindsey Crosby is a prospect encyclopedia. We've had him right here on Locked On Red Sox before, talking all things prospects, maybe what a trade for Brian Reynolds would look like, and he knows his prospects. He's going deep on the MLB stars of tomorrow. It's free and available wherever you get your podcast. We hope you have a great weekend on tap. We will be back on Monday with the latest episode of Locked On Red Sox. Hopefully we can talk more about some good news, and we do have some player interviews coming up as well throughout the month of January. We are here throughout the offseason. Pitchers and catchers report in just a few weeks, and hopefully we'll get some clarity on what this Red Sox roster will look like going into 2023. But until then, we'll end this show how we always do. Let's go Red Sox.